All right, Philosophy 101, Introduction to Philosophy. Since the class is titled Introduction to Philosophy, I'm not going to presuppose any background knowledge. I'm not going to presuppose any familiarity with philosophy, so let's start at the very beginning. What is philosophy? There's no simple answer to that question. I suppose philosophers would disagree as to an exact definition, so there's no official definition that I can give you. I suppose that's true in lots of areas. Probably lots of subjects. Thinkers would disagree as to the exact definition. But let's start with the historical origin and meaning of the word. Philosophy comes from a couple of Greek words. Phileo is the Greek word for to love. So you recognize that word from lots of English words. Say, for example, philanthropist, a person who loves human beings, loves humanity, loves people. And so a philanthropist is someone who goes around doing all kinds of charitable acts out of his or her love for people. And then the Greek word sophos is the Greek word for wisdom. So literally, historically, originally it was love of wisdom. So I suppose the next question that would arise would be, wisdom about what? Well, wisdom about the big questions, wisdom about ultimate questions in life. Going back to the beginnings of Western philosophy in ancient Greece, starting with the first era of Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratic philosophers, philosophy began with speculation about the ultimate makeup, the ultimate nature, the ultimate organizing principle of the universe. So early on, initially, philosophy and what we might think of today as science were not distinct. Early pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, they speculated about the ultimate constituents or the ultimate makeup or the ultimate principle, ultimate organizing principle, they would sometimes say, of physical reality or just of the universe. So that was, on the one hand, both a kind of scientific hypothesis and a kind of broader metaphysical, kind of broader philosophical hypothesis about what was ultimately real. So early on, initially, here again, the two, philosophy and what we might think of as science today, the two were not really distinct. Not really distinct branches of inquiry. That kind of distinction took shape over time. So I would say a love of wisdom about ultimate questions, love of wisdom about ultimate issues. What is truth? What is true? What is reality? What is meaning? All these kinds of ultimate big questions in life and trying to go about them in a systematic, rigorous way. It has historically been characteristic of philosophy. So, again, phileo, to love, and sophos, wisdom. Love of wisdom about ultimate questions, questions of broad human significance. If I had to attempt a definition, I would say philosophy is rigorous logical analysis of our fundamental concepts, categories, and principles. So, what do I mean by concepts? Well, basic concepts such as time, space, the concept of change. Very early on in Greek philosophy, among these pre-Socratic philosophers, these very basic ideas were subjected to logical analysis. These concepts were subjected to a kind of logical analysis by thinkers who are trying to understand what is time really, what is the nature of time, what is space, what is change. Very early on, there was a movement within pre-Socratic philosophy, skeptical movement, you could say, the Eleatic school of philosophers. Eleatic philosophers like Parmenides and Zeno, who approached these very basic concepts like space, say for example, and found that logical analysis of that concept leads to contradictions. And so this was, I guess you could say, the first school of philosophers who thought that reality is probably radically different from what we take it to be. So that in itself is a big philosophical question, isn't it? That's a good philosophical question with which to begin. Do we have good reason to suspect, good reason to believe that maybe reality, what is true, what is real, is quite different from the way that we experience it, is quite different from the way that the world is presented to us in experience? That's a big philosophical question, isn't it? That would be an example of what I meant a moment ago when I said that philosophy is love of wisdom about big questions, such as that. So very early on, very basic concepts like time, space, change, physical, spiritual, mind, world, truth, reality. All these basic concepts were subjected to logical analysis, and different thinkers tried to give an account of what those concepts really come to, what they really amount to. I mentioned this early skeptical school, the Eleatic philosophers. For example, as a consequence of their logical analysis of the concept of space, came to a skeptical conclusion, came to the conclusion that space does not exist. So say, for example, Zeno argued that when you analyze the concept of space, you find that there's a contradiction in the concept, and so we should simply stop believing in space. And we should adopt the view that reality, although it appears to be spatial, reality is actually quite different from the way that we take it to be. The analysis of the concept of space, for example, led Zeno to think that space was not real. So one kind of argument that he gave was that if space were real, then it would be possible for one to move through space. That is to say, motion would be possible. But when you analyze the concept of space, what you find is that, contrary to appearances, although it seems like that is the case, actually that can't be the case. Reality must be quite different from what we take it to be. Because if one were to move through space, then there's this problematic logical consequence to that hypothesis, to saying that. And the problem, as Zeno saw it, was that to cross any space, one would first have to cross half of that space. Well, before one could cross half of that space, if one were to subdivide the initial space, before one could cross half of that space, one would have to cross half of that space. So if one were to subdivide here again. Well, Zeno's thought was that if space were something real, our concept of it is something that is infinitely divisible, something that is divisible ad infinitum, something that in principle could be divided forever. There is no smallest extension, there is no smallest region of space. At least here again, Zeno and Parmenides, other Eleatic philosophers, thought that that was part of our concept of space. If it were real, it would be something that were infinitely divisible. So to cross any extension, to cross any span of space, any segment of space, one would have to complete an infinite number of tasks. Because for every region of space that you could identify, there always is half of that region. So of course this could go on forever. So to move through space, one would have to actually take infinitely many steps, but it isn't possible to take infinitely many steps. Therefore, the concept of space contains a contradiction. Another of these Eleatic philosophers, another of these philosophers in this early pre-Socratic school, the Eleatic school of philosophy, took our concept of change and subjected it to, here again, a kind of rigorous logical analysis. And here again found that the concept of change entails a contradiction, such that contrary to appearances, it certainly appears that things change. It certainly appears that change is a feature of reality. Contrary to appearances, actually, change is not possible. And so reality is quite different from what we take it to be. So Parmenides had lots of arguments to the effect, for something to change, it would have to go from a state of not having some property to a state of having it. But for the thing to not have that property is to say that that property does not exist. So what would be an example? Well, let's take the example of an acorn changing into an oak tree. That would seem to be an example of change. Well, before he starts in on the argument, Parmenides gets you to agree to a first principle. So here again, this would be an example of what I mean in saying that philosophy is rigorous logical analysis of our fundamental concepts, categories, and principles. Take this fundamental principle. Something cannot come from nothing. That seems to be true. It's hard to see how you could get around the truth of that principle. We can't make any sense of something coming into existence out of nothing. Suppose there were nothing at all. How could something then come into existence? So it seems like that's true. It seems like something cannot come into existence out of nothing. Okay, well, in the apparent example of change, the apparent example of an acorn changing into an oak tree, Parmenides would argue that that amounts to saying that there was a time when the oak tree did not exist. Well, if there was a time when it did not exist, here again, something cannot come from nothing, therefore it's not possible that the oak tree came into existence out of a state of non-existence. Therefore, the concept of change is a kind of illusion. Our concept of change contains a contradiction, and so this would be another example of a philosopher who would argue that reality is quite different from what we take it to be. So those would be some examples of what I mean by fundamental concepts. Categories. Well, we carve reality up into some basic categories, or at least this has historically been characteristic of philosophy. It has been, among other things, an attempt to lay down the basic categories of reality. So, say for example, the categories of matter and mind. Perhaps all of reality can be subsumed under these two categories: material things and mental things. Material things on the one side, what we might call physical things, and minds on the other side, which perhaps are not physical, although the mind is perhaps closely connected to the physical side of our existence. But that's an example of a big philosophical question. Is the mind just the same thing as the physical side of our existence? Is the mind just the same thing as the brain? Should it just be identified with the brain, say, for example? Or is it something distinct from the physical side of our existence? Something distinct, but something that at the same time somehow interacts with the physical side of our existence. Is the mind something that could survive our biological death? Is immortality a possibility? These are big philosophical questions. Perhaps the mind is something distinct from the material side of our existence, not to be identified with it, but perhaps it's something that depends on the physical side of our existence, and so at biological death, the mental side of our existence goes out of existence as well. Or another possibility is that the mental side of our existence, the part of us that thinks, reasons, perhaps that is something that could, in principle, survive our biological death. The stream of consciousness that is characteristic of our mental lives, perhaps that could continue after our biological death, and in some sense immortality is a possibility. Well, this big philosophical question has a lot to do with how we carve up reality into what we take to be the basic categories. Perhaps we categorize everything as falling under either the world as something distinct from minds, and then minds as something distinct from the world. Or here again, maybe material things, matter on the one side, and mind. Maybe the material on one side and the spiritual. These are some basic categories. And then what do I mean by fundamental principles? Well, we focus in on some very basic rules for thinking in philosophy. I just gave an example a moment ago in connection with Parmenides' criticism of the concept of change, the principle that something cannot come from nothing. Another kind of axiomatic principle or basic principle, a principle that cannot be derived from anything simpler, simply has to be posited as a first rule for thinking, would be, say, for example, the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing happens without an effect. Or the principle of sufficient reason is sometimes defined in this way: no effect without a cause. Here again, that seems true, and it seems like a fundamental principle for all rational inquiry. These are the kinds of principles that I have in mind by fundamental principles. The principle of sufficient reason is sometimes explained as the thesis, or the principle, I should say, that for every state of affairs in the universe, there is a reason why it is that way, rather than some other way. So the principle of sufficient reason would be an example of a fundamental principle that is oftentimes invoked in philosophy. Another old principle of reasoning, a fundamental principle, another of these axioms of thinking that go back to Aristotle, would be the principle of the excluded middle. Something cannot both have and not have the same property at the same time. So to go back to my earlier example, something cannot at the same time both be an acorn and not be an acorn, or have the property of being an oak tree and at the same time not have that property. So that seems about as basic as you can get, the law of the excluded middle. It's hard to see how you would move forward in any kind of inquiry if you weren't taking that as a first principle. Well, that is part of what philosophy focuses on. It does focus in on these first principles, these basic axioms, these basic rules for all thinking. So let me talk about a few different branches of philosophy. This might be one way to get the big picture rather than trying to proceed from a definition. It might be useful to look at the different areas of inquiry that fall under the heading of philosophy. Some branches of philosophy, there are many, but I'll just focus in for our purposes now on a few. Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. These are some big branches of philosophy. Metaphysics and epistemology are sometimes characterized as falling under theoretical philosophy. Sometimes the distinction is drawn between theoretical philosophy on one side and practical philosophy on the other side. So ethics is a branch of philosophy that would fall under the heading of practical philosophy. Reasoning about how to act, reasoning about how to live, reasoning about what to value, reasoning about what to think is right, what to think is wrong, what to think is good, what to think is bad. So sometimes this distinction is made. Metaphysics, epistemology, these fall under the broad heading theoretical philosophy. Metaphysics, I would say, is the branch of philosophy in which some of the following questions are examined. So here again, it might be better not to try to give a definition, but rather to look at some of the characteristic questions, some of the characteristic topics that come up in a branch of philosophy. What exists? Say, for example, this is a basic metaphysical question. I just mentioned these basic categories a moment ago, matter and mind. It would be a basic metaphysical question: do these things exist? Perhaps all of reality is only one kind of thing. Perhaps all of reality is only material. Or perhaps all of reality is only mental, only spiritual. These would be some possible metaphysical hypotheses. Does God exist? Obviously, that's a big metaphysical question. Do bodies exist? Do minds exist? Perhaps bodies and minds exist. Do they both exist? Or is, here again, is it perhaps the case that only one, contrary to appearances, only one kind of thing exists? And here again, that would be a kind of metaphysical view on which reality is perhaps quite different from what we take it to be. Another big metaphysical question would be, what is the nature and structure of reality? Say, for example, are there connections between events, what we might think of as causal connections, cause-effect connections between events? I just mentioned the principle of sufficient reason a moment ago, which is sometimes explained as the principle that there is no effect without a cause. So that seems pretty basic to our thinking, doesn't it? But here again, there have been skeptical philosophers who have challenged our belief that we have the knowledge that we think we have. So we take ourselves to know that there are connections between events in the world, what we might think of as causal connections. But one skeptical philosopher that we'll talk about in this course, David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, presented some pretty powerful arguments that actually we do not have the knowledge that we take ourselves to have when we believe that we know two events are connected. So there I'm starting to get into an epistemological question as well. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with the nature of knowledge. But a basic metaphysical concept here again would be the concept of a cause, or the concepts cause and effect. Are there, in the structure of reality, causal connections between events? We take ourselves to know that, but we'll see that there are skeptical arguments that can be given against that view. Hume will argue that when we really introspect, when we really study the content of our experiences, when we think we're experiencing a causal connection between events, actually no such connection can be found. So that would be here again a skeptical position on some of our basic intuitive beliefs about the structure of reality. A very basic metaphysical question would be, what am I? Am I essentially a body, a physical thing? Am I essentially a soul, a spiritual thing? Am I perhaps some combination of the two? The two somehow interact, the physical side of my existence and the mental or spiritual side of my existence are somehow distinct but somehow interact. Obviously, this is a profound metaphysical question. What am I? Am I the kind of thing that could survive my biological death? Obviously, that's a profound metaphysical question. Why does anything happen? Here again, that's a basic metaphysical question, isn't it? I said a moment ago in explaining the principle of sufficient reason that for everything that happens, there must be a reason. That seems like a pretty basic principle, an axiomatic principle for all reasoning. But again, it's hard to see how you would move forward if you didn't grant the truth of that principle. But I also mentioned earlier that Parmenides, for example, would be a skeptical philosopher who argued against the possibility of change, argued that actually change is not possible. It's actually change is not real, contrary to appearances. Again, this would be a view according to which reality is quite different from what we take it to be. But Parmenides would therefore deny that anything does happen. So that's one possible metaphysical position, deny the reality of change, argue that actually nothing happens, reality is actually unchanging. Or if one adopts the opposite thesis that change is real, then of course it's a further question. When something does happen, why does it happen? Here again, this would be a metaphysical view that presupposes that we can have some knowledge of causal connections between events. Does something happen because of the previous physical event? Does something happen because of some previous mental event, some intention to bring about a change in the world? If so, how is it possible that something mental brings about a change in something physical? These would be some basic metaphysical questions. A profound metaphysical question would be, why is there anything rather than nothing? There could have been nothing. At least that's a logical possibility. There doesn't seem to be any contradiction in the possibility that there could have been nothing. That's what I mean by it's being logically possible. Anyway, there's no contradiction in the thought. And yet there is something. Here we are. Now, why is that the case? Why is there anything rather than nothing? There could have been nothing. That's a profound metaphysical question. isn't it? We're going to get into that question in the first unit of the course. The first unit of the course has to do with the big metaphysical question to do with the existence of God. And we're going to look at some classic arguments for the existence of God, and we're going to look at some classical criticisms of those, some traditional criticisms of those classic arguments. But it's an old idea in philosophy. Many philosophers have had the thought, going back to, here again, very early in the history of Western philosophy. It's an old idea that because there is something, namely the physical universe, the physical reality in which we find ourselves, and because there could have been nothing, the fact that there is something demands an explanation. And for many people, generally, and for many philosophers in particular, the explanation has been God, something that is distinct from the physical reality that exists that created it. And so we'll look at some of the classic arguments for that basic metaphysical thesis. A profound metaphysical question would be, do I ever act freely? That is to say, the old metaphysical problem of freedom of the will. Is the physical side of our nature completely determined? Perhaps it's the case that everything physical that happens is determined by the kinds of causal laws that are discovered in the natural sciences. And if that's the case, then the physical side of our nature would appear to be completely determined. Well, we act in the world if the mental side of our existence, the side of us that acts, the side of us that chooses, the side of us that decides, that deliberates, that chooses to act in a certain way, that side of our nature acts through the physical side of our existence. If indeed it's not to be identified with that side of our existence. Perhaps they're just the same thing, but even if they are distinct, it would seem that we act through the physical side of our nature, through our physical bodies in the world, in the physical world. But if everything physical that happens is already determined, then it's a question, isn't it? It's a profound metaphysical question, isn't it? Do we ever act freely? The motion of all matter is arguably determined by the kinds of causal laws identified by physics. So a human being's lips are made of matter, so presumably the motions of that matter as well are determined by the kinds of causal laws identified by natural sciences, like physics. Well, if the motion of your lips is determined, then what you're going to say is already determined. Can you ever freely express your mind? Can you ever freely express something that is distinct from the physical side of your nature? Or is, here again, the universe a closed, deterministic system in which everything that will ever happen, including the ways that you act in the world, such as through speaking, say, for example, all of that is already determined by the kinds of causal laws that the physical sciences discover and presumably will go on to continue to discover. Causal laws like the universal law of gravitation, Newton's laws of motion, laws of thermodynamics, all the other kinds of laws, Boyle's law in chemistry for the inverse relation between pressure and volume in a gas, all the different causal laws that the physical sciences discover. It seems like in principle, if physics were completed and all the causal laws were discovered, then everything that ever happens, at least everything physical that ever happens, would be in the deterministic grip of a causal web that is the universe. And here again, insofar as we act, it seems like we act through the physical side of our existence, but if everything physical that ever happens is already determined, then it's a question, isn't it, whether it can truly be said that we act freely. So that would be an example of a profound metaphysical question. Epistemology has to do with knowledge. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy in which some of these questions are examined, questions that have to do with knowledge. What is knowledge? Obviously, that's a basic epistemological question. And there's no simple answer to that question. There's much debate, much disagreement about that within this branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge, epistemology. It's an old observation in philosophy that for you to know something, you have to believe it. Obviously, if you didn't believe it, then it couldn't really be said that you know it. So you have to believe it. But it isn't just enough to believe it. People have lots of false beliefs. So if a belief is false, then you can't say that you know it, because you can't know what isn't so, what isn't the case. So for you to know something, you have to believe it, and your belief has to be true. But even that is not yet knowledge, isn't it? So it's an old observation in philosophy that true belief is not yet knowledge. What more is needed for the true belief to count as knowledge? Well, that's an old epistemological question, and that has been a focus of debate in epistemology for a long, long time. There are lots of beliefs that you have that are true or that may be true, but you wouldn't say that you know them, right? So suppose, for example, someone believes that the number 7 is prime. That's true. But does he or she know it? Suppose you ask him, why do you believe that? And suppose he or she says, well, because it's odd. So suppose he mistakenly thinks that all odd numbers are prime. Well, then he doesn't really know, does he? Or she doesn't really know, does she, that 7 is a prime number? She has a belief, and it's a true belief, but it doesn't really rise to the status of knowledge, does it? Because it's a true belief that he or she has just accidentally, right? It doesn't really rise to the level of knowledge, because he or she also thinks that all odd numbers are prime, but that's not true. So you can't really be said that he or she knows that. So what do I know? What is knowledge? What is knowledge of? Is it of propositions? Is it of the content of my experience? I take myself to know the color of the shirt that I'm wearing at the moment, say, for example. That might be one candidate for the basic kind of thing that we know, the basic content of our perceptual experience. It's an old debate in philosophy whether perception, though, really rises to the level of knowledge. Obviously, there's misperception and lots of gray areas with respect to perception, perceptual illusions. It's not clear that perceptual knowledge is really all that reliable, maybe not, but that's an old debate. It's an old debate in epistemology whether perception, the content of our perceptual experience, really rises to the level of something that we know. So this would be the question, what is knowledge of? Maybe knowledge is of propositions, statements, we might say, such as that Columbia is the capital of South Carolina, or water is H2O. Maybe knowledge is not of the content of our immediate experience, but maybe something more objective, something broader, like true propositions. And here again, it wouldn't be enough just to believe the true proposition. You would have to have some sense of why it's true, some understanding of why it's true for that true belief to count as knowledge. That's an old epistemological question. When am I justified in taking myself to know something? Here again, that's a profound epistemological question. You might take yourself to know something on the basis of perception, say, for example. But we know that perception is not entirely reliable. We're liable, we're all susceptible to perceptual errors. So it's a question whether the fact that you saw X is really justification for saying that you know X is the case. And so how strong does the justification need to be for your belief to count as knowledge? That's this old question to do with justification. I gave an example a moment ago of someone who would have true belief, but that true belief is not justified, would not be one would not be justified in calling that true belief knowledge. So I can recall, say for example, the first time that I saw the multiplication sign, the first time that I saw the X, very early on in my learning of rudimentary arithmetic. I think it was kindergarten or so. I saw that in a book, multiplication symbol 2, and I asked someone what that means, and then I was told that 2 times 2 equals 4, and so I thought, oh, well, I already knew that 2 plus 2 was equal to 4, so I thought, oh, that means the same thing as addition. So given that that was the first example that I was given, it's perhaps not surprising that I would think that they just come to the same thing. So at that very early stage, just on the basis of being told, I had a true belief, but I wouldn't say that my true belief rose to the level of knowledge. I wouldn't say that I would be justified in calling that item of true belief knowledge, because I didn't really have any kind of understanding of why that belief was true. I just did believe it, and it happened to be true. It was just kind of accidentally true, right? That doesn't really rise to the level of knowledge yet. Or here again, if the person who believes that 7 is prime believes it because she mistakenly thinks that all odd numbers are prime, then he or she doesn't really know it. One would not be justified in saying that those true beliefs really rose to the status of knowledge. And then here again, this related question, what is the source of knowledge? Here again, is perception a source of knowledge? It would certainly appear to be. I take myself to know lots of things about the world on the basis of the fact that I perceive them, or I perceive the world to be a certain way. We will take a look at, later in the course though, take a look at arguments that can be given against the proposition that perception is a source of knowledge. Is reason a source of knowledge? Here again, at first glance, it would appear to be. But of course, you can reason your way to lots of conclusions. You can infer lots of conclusions on the basis of perfectly good reasoning. But if you're beginning from false premises, then all of them are on a shaky foundation, aren't they? So when everyone believed in the geocentric model of the universe, say for example, when everybody believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and that the sun traveled around the Earth, the apparent motion of the sun around us is produced by the Earth being at the center and the sun actually moving around us. When people had that false belief, they made all kinds of inferences. There was astronomy, there was physics, there were all kinds of physical sciences, and all kinds of inferences were made that were correct inferences. They were rational, they were logical, but all of that reasoning was based on a false belief. So it's a real question. Is reason a source of knowledge? If one can reason one's way to a whole web, a whole network of beliefs that have some false foundation, then one has a perfectly perhaps coherent system of beliefs, but they're all false. So it's an old debate in epistemology, is what is the source of knowledge, or what are the sources of knowledge? Is perception a source of knowledge? Is reason a source of knowledge? We'll get into this issue in different ways in this class. The branch of philosophy that has to do with right and wrong, good and bad, values, justice. Ethics is the branch of philosophy in which some of the following questions are examined. What is right? What is wrong? That is to say, what is the right thing to do? Maybe something like that. Is it ever, say for example, is it ever right to lie? Or is lying always wrong? If it is sometimes right, if it is sometimes the right thing to do, then what justifies making the exception to what would otherwise seem to be a rule of ethics? One ought not to lie. That's obviously a profound ethical question. So ethics investigates those kinds of questions. Is lying ever right, or is it always wrong? If it is sometimes right, what would justify one in calling it right? What kinds of circumstances would justify saying that it is right or morally permissible, we might say? Is killing ever right? If it is the right thing to do, what justifies one in saying that it is right? Is it ever right or is it always wrong? Obviously, this is a profound ethical question. If it is right some of the time, then what would justify it in making it morally permissible in those cases? So what is right, what is wrong in the sense of what is the right thing to do, or what would it be wrong to do? Another kind of ethical question would be, what is right, what is wrong in quotation marks, by which I indicate here that now I'm asking about the meaning of the word right. What does it mean to say that something is right is a kind of profound ethical question. That would get us into ethical theories of the nature of rightness and wrongness themselves. Does rightness just mean something like the act conforms to the law? That would not seem to be an adequate theory of morality, because not everything that's legal is necessarily morally right. And it may be the case that some of the time the morally right thing to do is to oppose an unjust law, so that would not be an adequate ethical theory, would it? Is it the case that something is right because it conforms to the will of God, to some natural law that reason can discover, somehow in the fabric of reality, moral truth is woven in? Obviously, that's a profound ethical and a profound metaphysical question as well, isn't it? Is it perhaps the case one might take a skeptical view? So many philosophers have argued skeptically and argued that there isn't any objective fact of the matter as to whether something is right or wrong. Statements about right or wrong really just express our preferences, or express our likes or dislikes, or express our values, we might say, but don't really rise to the level of objective facts, don't really rise to the level of objectively true statements, because they really have only to do with human interests or human attitudes. That's a profound kind of ethical question, isn't it? Again, what is good, what is bad? That is to say, we might say what is truly valuable, what is truly of value, or what is truly important. That's a kind of ethical question. What kinds of things ought we to value? What kinds of things are truly important? These are profound ethical questions that have to do with the nature of value, the nature of what is good. And then the broader kind of philosophical question, what does the word good mean? What do we even mean in saying that something is of value or something is a value? What do we even mean by that? Is happiness a value? Say, for example, is happiness truly good? Is happiness perhaps the good? Is perhaps that what we mean by the word good? When we say something is good, we really just mean something like that would be conducive to happiness. It would make me, or it would make people in general happy. Therefore it's a good thing. Kindness is good. Maybe that just means kindness is a trait of character or a trait of action that brings about human happiness. Or is there some broader metaphysical basis for what is truly good? So these would be some profound ethical questions. In this course, we're not going to get into ethics. There just isn't time in a short introduction to philosophy class to cover every branch of philosophy. In this class, we're going to focus on a few metaphysical and epistemological topics. The course is going to be divided into a few sections. We're going to start with this profound metaphysical question to do with the existence of God. Does God exist? What are the classical arguments for the thesis or the proposition that God exists? And what have been some of the traditional criticisms of those arguments? In the next unit of the class, we'll look at another profound metaphysical and epistemological issue, the question of the relation between the mind and the world. Here again, does the mind show us the way that the world is? That's a profound philosophical question, isn't it? Or are there good reasons to suspect that maybe reality is quite different from what we take it to be? So the knowledge that we think that we have, here again, this is an epistemological question as well, the knowledge that we think that we have about reality, about the physical world in which we find ourselves, is in fact not knowledge, or perhaps much of it is not in fact the knowledge that we take ourselves to have. And reality is here again quite different from what we take it to be. So the metaphysical truth of the matter is that reality is quite different from what we think it is. And of course, intermediate views on the spectrum, these are all possibilities too. In some respects, our ideas of the world are accurate. In other respects, our ideas about the world are not. So there's a spectrum of views that one can take on this issue, and we'll see what there is to say on different sides of the spectrum. And then in the third unit of the course, we'll look at the nature of the mind, and we'll touch on particular topics such as what we should think about minds and computers, that is to say the kinds of minds that we have, the kinds of mental states that perhaps computers or perhaps artificial intelligence systems could have. Are they the same? Are human beings just machines of a certain kind, made of organic matter, and our mental states, our mental operations are in principle not any different from the operational states of an artificial intelligence? This is a profound metaphysical question, isn't it? What should we think about the mind? Is it just to be identified with the physical side of our existence, in which case the brain would just be a kind of organic computer, or is it something that is not entirely reducible to or to be identified with the physical side of our existence? So in this class, we're going to focus on some profound metaphysical and epistemological questions, some big questions. But one might also like to, at some other point, take a class in ethics or a philosophy class that deals with applied ethics, ethical theories and their application to particular areas of life, like bioethical ethics or legal ethics or business ethics. These are common applied ethics classes that students oftentimes take. So at some point you might like to look into this side of philosophy as well, this area of philosophy that is sometimes put under the heading of practical philosophy, reasoning about how to live, how to act, what to value. Ethical questions. This is a very important branch of philosophy as well, but in this class we're going to focus on some metaphysical and epistemological topics.